When I asked to join the family jet trip, my in-laws laughed. She should be grateful we let her in the house. She can take a bus. I stayed quiet. They landed in a storm. I touched down in Bora Bora. First class, private, and not alone. She should be grateful we let her in the house. She can take a bus. The words hit me like ice water. Cousin Margaret's voice carried across the marble foyer, bouncing off the crystal chandelier above us. The family jet trip to Martha's Vineyard had been planned for months, and somehow I'd foolishly thought, after 2 years of marriage, that I might finally be included. I stood there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one Anthony had complimented that morning, watching as 23 members of the Whitmore family burst into laughter. The sound echoed through the grand entrance hall like a chorus of mockery, each chuckle another nail in the coffin of my dignity. Anthony's laugh was the loudest. My husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me, threw his head back and laughed at his cousin's joke. About me. About his wife. The woman carrying his child. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing stories about standing up for what's right. If you believe that love and respect should never be conditional on wealth, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women facing similar struggles. Now let's see how this unfolds. The first time I'd stepped into this mansion 3 years ago, I'd felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Everything was too big, too shiny, too intimidating. The marble floors stretched like frozen lakes beneath my feet. Gold-framed portraits of long-dead Whitmores stared down at me with disapproving eyes, as if they could sense I didn't belong in their bloodline. The entrance hall alone was larger than my childhood home. Dual staircases curved upward like arms reaching toward heaven, their mahogany banisters polished to perfection. A chandelier the size of a small car hung overhead, its crystals catching the afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the walls. Everything screamed old money, established power, untouchable status. I had married into wealth, yes, but I'd walked through the service entrance. That first dinner remains burned into my memory. 24 place settings of bone china, silver cutlery that probably cost more than my car, and cloth napkins folded into perfect swans. I'd been seated between Anthony's teenage nephew and the family priest, the conversational equivalent of Siberia. So, Kristen, Anthony's sister Victoria had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, Anthony tells us you worked in retail? The way she said retail made it sound like I'd been cleaning sewers. I'd managed a boutique clothing store actually. Had a degree in fashion merchandising. Built a small but loyal customer base through genuine care and attention to detail. But under Victoria's gaze, my accomplishments shriveled like flowers in winter. I managed a boutique in the arts district, I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. How quaint, she'd responded, then immediately turned to discuss the family's latest acquisition, a vineyard in Tuscany. Conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed board meetings I'd never attend, charity galas I'd never be invited to, family vacations that happened without me. I became an expert at nodding politely while feeling completely erased. Anthony's Aunt Millicent was the worst. During my second visit, she'd actually handed me her fur coat when I'd walked into the sitting room. "Be a dear and hang this up properly," she'd said without looking up from her magazine. When I'd stood there, confused, she'd glanced up with irritation. "Well, the coat closet is right there." I'd hung up the coat. Anthony had been in the room. He'd watched the entire exchange while sipping his brandy. When I'd caught his eye, he just shrugged and smiled, that easy, dismissive smile that meant, "Don't make a scene." Later, when I'd brought it up in the car, he'd laughed it off. "She's old-fashioned, Chris. He treats everyone like the help. Don't take it personally." But how could I not take it personally when it happened again and again? When I'd offer to help with dinner preparations and be waved away like an intrusion. When conversations stopped when I entered rooms. When family photos were taken without anyone thinking to include me. The isolation was suffocating. At family gatherings, I'd find myself gravitating toward the edges of rooms, nursing a glass of sparkling water while everyone else drank champagne. I'd learned to smile and nod, to laugh at jokes I didn't understand about people I'd never met, to pretend I wasn't slowly disappearing. Stella was different. Stella Whitmore, the family matriarch at 82, had built this empire alongside her late husband. She was small but commanding, with silver hair always perfectly styled and eyes that missed nothing. While others in the family seemed to look through me, she looked at me. really looked. During my third visit, she'd noticed me standing alone on the terrace while everyone else mingled inside. She'd approached with 2 cups of tea and sat beside me on the stone bench. "They're overwhelming, aren't they?" she'd said simply. I'm still adjusting," I'd replied carefully. Adjusting to being invisible? The directness had startled me. I'd looked at her, searching for mockery, but found only understanding. "Anthony loves you," she'd continued. "I can see it in the way he looks at you when you're not watching. But love isn't always enough to build a bridge over decades of privilege and assumption." From that day forward, Stella made sure I was included. She'd save the seat beside her at dinner. She'd ask about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. She'd bring me tea when the family gatherings became too much. When I'd started getting migraines from the stress, she'd notice immediately and guide me to a quiet room to rest. She was the only one who noticed when I stopped drinking champagne at family events. The only one who saw my hands trembling when I thought no one was looking. The only one I'd trusted with my secret. 30 days pregnant. After 2 years of trying, countless doctor visits, and the heartbreak of IVF treatments that Anthony had increasingly distanced himself from. The day I'd gotten the positive test, I'd called Stella before I'd even called my husband. "I'm pregnant," I'd whispered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, my dear girl," she'd breathed. "Oh, this is wonderful news." She'd been my anchor through the terrifying early weeks. The phone calls to check on my nausea. The reminders to take my vitamins. The gentle questions about how I was feeling emotionally. She'd even offered to come with me to my first official appointment when Anthony had to handle something at the office. So when Margaret's cruel words cut through the air that day, when the family's laughter felt like daggers, I'd instinctively looked for Stella. She was standing near the window, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. But her expression wasn't shocked or embarrassed like I'd expected. It was furious. I'd never seen Stella angry before. Her face remained composed, but her eyes had turned to ice. She was staring at her family, her legacy, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The disappointment radiating from her was almost tangible. She set down her teacup with deliberate precision. The small sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that followed the laughter. Margaret was still wiping tears from her eyes, delighted with her own cleverness. "How amusing," Stella said, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I wasn't aware we'd become the sort of family that mocks pregnant women." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's smile faltered. Anthony's laughter died in his throat. Everyone turned to stare at me, confusion and calculation flickering across their faces. But Stella wasn't done. She walked across the room with measured steps, her cane tapping against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to judgment. "Kristen," she said, reaching for my hand. "Would you join me in the study? I believe we have some important matters to discuss." As she led me away from the frozen tableau of the family, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like hope. Or perhaps something that felt like justice. Stella's study felt like a sanctuary compared to the harsh laughter we'd left behind in the foyer. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that actually looked read rather than displayed. A Persian rug covered most of the hardwood floor, and afternoon sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in a warm golden glow. She closed the door with a soft click and gestured toward the burgundy leather armchair beside her desk. I sank into it gratefully, my legs suddenly feeling unsteady. The weight of the morning, of Margaret's cruel words, of Anthony's betraying laughter, of carrying this secret alone, pressed down on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Tell me everything," Stella said simply, settling into her own chair behind the desk. "From the beginning." The beginning. Where was that exactly? The first time I'd felt nauseous and blamed it on stress? The morning I'd stared at the pregnancy test with shaking hands? Or was it further back, to the fertility clinic waiting rooms that had become as familiar as my own living room? "It's been almost 2 years, I whispered, my voice barely audible. 2 years of trying, of hoping, of feeling like my body was failing me. Stella leaned forward, her weathered hands folded on the desk. "Anthony." I let out a bitter laugh. Anthony said I was becoming obsessed. That I needed to relax and let nature take its course. Easy words from someone who didn't have to track ovulation cycles or give themselves hormone injections in the bathroom at work. The memories flooded back unbidden. Dr. Martinez explaining that my fallopian tubes showed some scarring from an infection I'd had in college. The cascade of treatments that followed. Pills that made me nauseated, shots that left bruises on my stomach, procedures with cold metal instruments and clinical words that made something as intimate as creating life feel mechanical and sterile. I remember the first appointment Anthony missed, I continued, staring at my hands. It was the consultation for IVF. I sat in that waiting room for 3 hours, watching other couples hold hands and whisper encouragements to each other. When I called him, he said a client meeting had run late. When I got home, I found him playing golf with his college friends. Stella's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. The second missed appointment was worse. It was the egg retrieval procedure. I'd been taking hormone shots for weeks, feeling bloated and emotional and scared. I needed someone there when I woke up. The nurse kept asking where my husband was and I kept making excuses. My voice cracked. He forgot. He actually forgot. That day remained etched in my memory with painful clarity. Waking up groggy and alone in the recovery room, the nurse's pitying smile, the taxi ride home while feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Anthony had been watching baseball when I'd walked through the door, and his first words had been asking what was for dinner. "I called you that night," I said to Stella. "Do you remember?" I was crying so hard I could barely speak. "I remember," she said softly. "You said you felt invisible." I did. I felt like I was fighting this battle completely alone while my own husband treated it like an inconvenience to his schedule. Stella rose from her chair and moved to the window, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Outside, I could see the landscaped gardens where the family's children often played during gatherings. Children who would grow up with every advantage, never knowing what it was like to beg the universe for the basic gift of motherhood. When the first IVF cycle failed, I continued, Anthony said maybe it was a sign. Maybe we should just accept that children weren't in our future. He suggested we get a dog instead. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Stella turned from the window, her expression fierce. "That's when I offered to help with the second cycle," she said. "Not because I pitied you, but because I recognized something in you that no one else in this family possesses." "What's that?" "The capacity to love something more than yourself." The money had appeared in my account with a simple note. "For the future of our family." $15,000. Stella had made it clear that Anthony was never to know where the funding had come from. When I tried to thank her, she'd waved away my gratitude with characteristic directness. "You don't thank family for investing in family," she'd said. The second IVF cycle had been different because Stella had been present for it. She'd driven me to appointments when Anthony was handling important business. She'd brought thermoses of ginger tea for my nausea and crossword puzzle books to distract me during the long waits. She'd held my hand during the embryo transfer, whispering prayers under her breath. "You know," she'd said during one of those quiet car rides home, "I had 3 miscarriages before Anthony's father was born. People didn't talk about such things back then. You suffered in silence and pretended everything was fine. I used to think that made us stronger. Now I wonder if it just made us lonelier." She'd paused, navigating a turn with careful precision. "You're the only person in this house with a real heart, Kristen. That's why I chose you." At the time, I'd thought she meant she'd chosen to help me. Now, sitting in her study with the echo of the family's laughter still ringing in my ears, I was beginning to understand she'd meant something much larger. When the pregnancy test had finally shown 2 pink lines, I'd stared at it for 10 full minutes, afraid to blink in case it disappeared. My hands had shaken so violently I'd nearly dropped the test. After 2 years of negative results, of monthly disappointments that felt like small deaths, seeing those lines had been like watching the sun rise after the longest night of my life. I'd called Stella before I'd even called Anthony. "It worked," I'd whispered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. "Stella, it actually worked." Her silence had stretched so long I'd thought the call had dropped. Then I'd heard her crying, soft, gentle sobs that spoke of her own long-held hopes and fears. "Oh, my dear girl," she'd finally managed. "This changes everything. I want to tell Anthony tonight. When he gets home from work. I want it to be special." "Of course you do." Her voice had carried a strange note, something I couldn't identify. "But Kristen, This child will be the first great-grandchild. The heir to everything we've built. That makes you far more powerful than they realize. I hadn't understood what she'd meant then. I'd been too caught up in the joy of finally being pregnant. But over the following weeks, as Anthony's enthusiasm had quickly faded into casual indifference, as the family had continued treating me like an afterthought, Stella's words had begun to make sense. Now, sitting in her study after enduring Margaret's public humiliation, I watched Stella move to her desk and pull out a leather address book. She flipped through pages with purpose, found what she was looking for, and reached for the phone. Ashley. Her voice was crisp, businesslike. Yes, it's Stella. I need you to come to the house this evening. We have some documents to revise. She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. All of them, she said firmly. I'm changing everything. I don't want a single piece of this house in the hands of people who mock love. The conversation continued, but I'd stopped listening. Something was happening. Something bigger than pregnancy announcements or hurt feelings. Stella was making decisions that would reshape everything, and somehow I was at the center of it all. When she hung up, she looked at me with eyes that held both tenderness and steel. Are you ready to stop being invisible, my dear? Before I could answer Stella's question about being ready to stop being invisible, the sound of car tires on gravel echoed through the study windows. Stella glanced at her watch, 10:47 p.m., and smiled with satisfaction. That will be Ashley, she said, rising from her chair with purpose. Always punctual, even at inconvenient hours. I heard the front door open downstairs, followed by the click of heels on marble. No voices, no greetings, just efficient movement. Within minutes, Ashley Montgomery appeared in the doorway of the study, and I understood immediately why Stella had called her. Ashley was everything the Whitmore family pretended to be but wasn't, genuinely powerful. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, but it wasn't for show. This was a woman who commanded boardrooms and courtrooms with equal ease. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her blue eyes assessed the room with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Stella, she said, setting down a black leather briefcase with deliberate care. I came as soon as I could. Thank you, dear. You remember my granddaughter-in-law, Kristen. Ashley's gaze shifted to me, and I felt evaluated in a way that was neither hostile nor friendly, simply thorough. Of course. Congratulations on your pregnancy. I blinked in surprise. How did you? Stella called me 3 weeks ago about updating her medical directives, Ashley explained, pulling out a chair. She mentioned wanting to ensure proper provisions for any future great-grandchildren. I've been preparing preliminary documents ever since. The realization hit me like cold water. Stella hadn't just been planning this conversation, she'd been orchestrating it for weeks. Every gentle question about my doctor appointments, every knowing look when I'd declined wine at dinner, every careful inquiry about Anthony's level of involvement in my pregnancy, it had all been building to this moment. You've been planning this, I said, though it wasn't really a question. I've been hoping for it, Stella corrected. There's a difference. Hope requires faith in people's better nature. Planning assumes it won't surface on its own. Ashley opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency, revealing neat stacks of documents, a digital recorder and several fountain pens arranged in precise order. Before we begin, I need to confirm your mental capacity and decision-making ability for the record. What followed was a brief but thorough examination. Ashley asked Stella to recite her full name, the date, the address of the property, and the names of her immediate family members. She inquired about current events, recent conversations, and medical treatments. Stella answered each question with sharp clarity, occasionally adding sardonic commentary about her relatives that made Ashley's mouth twitch with suppressed amusement. Satisfied? Stella asked when the questioning concluded. More than satisfied. Your mind is sharper than most people half your age. Ashley pressed a button on the small recorder. This is Ashley Montgomery, attorney at law, conducting a will modification session with Stella Patricia Whitmore on March 15th. Mrs. Whitmore, please state your intentions clearly for the record. I watched, mesmerized, as Stella transformed before my eyes. Gone was the gentle grandmother who brought me tea and asked about my day. In her place sat a woman who had built an empire alongside her husband, who had made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. I am of sound mind and body, Stella began, her voice carrying absolute authority. I wish to make comprehensive changes to my last will and testament, dated October 3rd of last year. Ashley's pen moved across legal documents with swift precision. Please specify the nature of these changes. All real estate properties, including the primary residence, the lake house, and the commercial holdings in downtown, are to be transferred into a trust for my great-grandchild, the child currently carried by Kristen Whitmore. I felt the air leave my lungs. The primary residence alone was worth millions. The downtown commercial properties generated enough rental income to support a lavish lifestyle indefinitely. All stock portfolios, investment accounts, and business interests are to be similarly transferred, Stella continued without pause. The child's mother, Kristen, will serve as trustee until the child reaches majority, with full authority to make decisions regarding the properties and investments. Stella, I whispered, finding my voice. This is too much. I can't. She held up one hand, stopping my protest. The current beneficiaries, my son Robert, my daughter-in-law Patricia, my grandson Anthony, and my granddaughters Victoria and Margaret, will receive a token inheritance of $10,000 each. Enough to cover funeral expenses and a nice vacation, but nothing more. Ashley's pen never stopped moving. She'd clearly handled dramatic inheritance changes before, though I suspected few had been quite this comprehensive. Any specific conditions or restrictions? Yes. Should Kristen divorce Anthony, she retains full control of the trust. Should Anthony attempt to claim any portion of the inheritance through marriage rights, the entire estate will be donated to the Children's Hospital Foundation. My hands were shaking now. The magnitude of what Stella was doing began to sink in. She wasn't just changing her will, she was completely restructuring the family's power dynamic. Anthony's parents, who had always treated me like an unwelcome addition to their social circle, would suddenly find themselves financially dependent on their son's wife. The same wife they'd spent 3 years dismissing and humiliating. There's more, Stella said, and Ashley looked up with raised eyebrows. I want a clause stating that any family member who contests this will forfeit their token inheritance entirely. And I want it noted that this decision was made in response to the family's treatment of my granddaughter-in-law, specifically their exclusion of a pregnant family member from a leisure trip. Stella, I managed to say, you don't have to do this because of what happened today. They were just being thoughtless. Thoughtless. Her voice sharpened. Kristen, I've watched them treat you like hired help for 3 years. I've seen Anthony ignore your needs, dismiss your feelings, and prioritize his family's approval over his wife's dignity. Today wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the most public example of a pattern I've been observing since the day you married into this family. Ashley finished writing and looked up. These are significant changes, Stella. Are you certain this reflects your true wishes? More certain than I've been about anything in years. Stella's voice softened slightly. Ashley, you've known me for 40 years. Have you ever seen me act impulsively? Never. Then trust that this decision comes from careful observation and deep consideration. Stella turned to look at me directly. Kristen, you gave me something no one else in this family has. Genuine affection without expectation of reward. You visited when you didn't have to, listened to my stories about your grandfather-in-law, and treated me like a person rather than a walking inheritance. More importantly, you're carrying the future of our family name. That child deserves to grow up with resources and security, guided by someone who understands the value of both. Ashley gathered the signed documents into a neat stack. I'll file these with the probate court first thing Monday morning. They'll become public record within 48 hours. Good, Stella said with satisfaction. I want there to be no question about the legitimacy of these changes. As Ashley packed her briefcase preparing to leave, she paused to look at me again. Mrs. Whitmore, I should inform you that this inheritance comes with significant responsibilities. Managing this level of wealth requires careful planning and professional guidance. I know, I said quietly. I'm not sure I'm ready for it. No one ever is, Stella said gently. But readiness isn't the same as worthiness. You'll learn, just as I did when your grandfather-in-law died and left me in charge of everything. After Ashley left, Stella and I sat in comfortable silence, listening to the grandfather clock in the corner tick away the minutes. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, not oppressive but significant. Are you angry with me? Stella asked finally. No, I replied, surprised to realize it was true. I'm terrified but not angry. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Complacency makes you vulnerable. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of the family's laughter as they finalized preparations for their morning departure. None of them had any idea that their world had just fundamentally shifted. When will you tell them? I asked. Stella smiled, her expression that was both grandmotherly and predatory. I won't. They'll find out when everyone else does. The morning departure was a spectacle of privilege and entitlement. I watched from the study window as 3 black town cars pulled up to the circular drive, their engines purring like satisfied cats. The family emerged from the house in waves. Louis Vuitton luggage, designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and that particular energy that comes from people who've never been told no. Anthony looked handsome in his navy blazer, the one I'd helped him pick out for our anniversary last year. He was laughing at something his sister Victoria had said, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. It was the same laugh I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, before I'd learned it could be turned into a weapon. Look at them, Stella murmured from beside me. Not a care in the world. Margaret was the loudest, as usual, directing the loading of luggage with the authority of someone who'd never carried her own suitcase. Make sure the wine cases go in the temperature-controlled compartment, she called to the driver. That Bordeaux cost more than most people's cars. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who'd mocked me for needing to take a bus, now obsessing over wine bottles that could fund a small business. Anthony's parents, Robert and Patricia, emerged last, dressed in matching cream-colored outfits that screamed, "We summer in the Hamptons." Patricia was checking her phone with the frantic energy of someone addicted to social media validation, while Robert adjusted his golf cap with the precision of a man who treated every public appearance as a photo opportunity. Kristen should have come, I heard Victoria say as she climbed into the middle car. She could have helped carry our beach bags. More laughter. Always more laughter at my expense. My phone buzzed against the windowsill, a weather alert that made my blood run cold. Severe thunderstorm warning. Private aircraft grounded until further notice. Lightning strikes reported at regional airport. All flights suspended. I showed the alert to Stella, who read it with the satisfaction of someone who'd been expecting exactly this news. How did you know? I whispered. I didn't know, she replied, settling back into her chair with her teacup. I hoped. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that humans lack. The cars disappeared down the winding driveway, carrying their precious cargo toward what they assumed would be a perfect weekend of sailing, spa treatments and social networking. None of them had checked the weather. Why would they? When you're wealthy enough, you assume the world bends to accommodate your schedule. But nature, it seemed, had other plans. By noon my phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic text messages. Anthony, 12:47 p.m. Flight delayed. Weather issues. Might be here a few hours. Anthony, 2:23 p.m. Still waiting. This is ridiculous. The pilot says it could be all day. Anthony, 4:15 p.m. Phone service is spotty. If you don't hear from me, we're stuck at this airfield in the middle of nowhere. I showed the messages to Stella, who was working on a crossword puzzle with the focus of someone solving international crises. 7 letters, she mused. Deserved consequences. Starts with K. Karma, I said without thinking. Perfect. Her pen moved across the squares with satisfaction. By evening the storm had intensified. Through the study windows, we watched lightning illuminate the sky in jagged silver streaks. Rain hammered against the glass with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, and the wind howled through the oak trees like something wild and angry. I imagined the family huddled in some cramped waiting area, their designer clothes wrinkled, their perfectly styled hair losing its battle against humidity. No 5-star accommodations, no staff to cater to their every whim. Just uncomfortable chairs, vending machine coffee, and each other's company. Do you think they're worried about us? I asked Stella. She looked up from her puzzle. Are you worried about them? The honesty of my answer surprised me. No, I'm not. That's when my phone rang with a call from Ashley. It's done, she said without preamble. The documents were filed at 3 p.m. Public records updated an hour ago. By morning, every financial institution, board member and business partner will have been notified. Stella gestured for me to put the call on speaker. Any complications? Stella asked. None. Your medical evaluations were comprehensive, the witnesses were beyond reproach, and the legal language is airtight. Even if they wanted to contest it, they'd have no grounds. I felt dizzy suddenly. While the family was trapped at an airfield, their entire world had been legally dismantled and rebuilt around my unborn child. They had no idea that every minute they spent complaining about delayed flights was another minute they remained unaware of their new reality. There's something else, Ashley continued. A reporter from the Business Journal called my office an hour ago. Someone leaked information about the will change. Stella's eyebrows rose. Leaked. These kinds of inheritance modifications always generate gossip in legal circles, especially when they involve this level of wealth transfer. I suspect we'll see news coverage by tomorrow. After Ashley hung up, Stella and I sat in contemplative silence. The storm outside seemed to be building rather than dissipating, and I found myself wondering if the family would be forced to spend the night at the airfield. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but instead I felt something closer to poetic justice. Stella, I said quietly, what happens when they find out? They'll be angry. They'll feel betrayed. They'll blame you, of course. And Anthony? She considered this carefully. Anthony will have to choose. For the first time in his life, he'll face a decision where his family's approval and his own interests are in direct conflict. The baby moved inside me then. A flutter so subtle I might have imagined it, except for the way it made my breath catch. I pressed my hand to my stomach, marveling at the tiny life that had somehow become the center of this family's universe. I felt that, I whispered. Stella's entire expression softened. The first movement? I think so. It was like a butterfly landing. She reached over and placed her weathered hand over mine. That child is going to inherit more than money, you know. They'll inherit the responsibility of rebuilding something that was broken. That's not a burden, it's a gift. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert from a business website. Whitmore fortune transferred to unborn heir in shocking will revision. The story was already public. While the family sat stranded and disconnected from the world was learning about their downfall. Stella read the alert over my shoulder and nodded with satisfaction. Perfect timing. They'll land tomorrow to discover that everyone already knows what they're just finding out. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it shook the windows. In the distance I could see emergency vehicles with flashing lights, probably dealing with downed power lines or flooded roads. The storm was affecting everyone, but somehow it felt personal. Like nature itself was ensuring the family remained isolated until justice had run its course. Do you think this makes us terrible people? I asked. Stella was quiet for a long moment, watching the lightning dance across the sky. I think, she said finally, that terrible people rarely ask that question. The silence that followed my question about being terrible people stretched until dawn. Stella had fallen asleep in her chair sometime after midnight, her crossword puzzle still balanced on her lap, pen clutched loosely in her fingers. I'd covered her with a throw blanket and spent the rest of the night watching the storm gradually exhaust itself against the windows. When my phone rang at 6:23 a.m., I knew before answering that the reckoning had begun. Kristen. Anthony's voice was raw, hoarse from what sounded like hours of shouting. What the hell did you do? I stepped out onto the terrace so I wouldn't wake Stella. The morning air smelled of rain and broken branches, and the gardens were littered with debris from the storm. It felt appropriate, like the landscape was reflecting what was about to happen to the family. I haven't done anything, Anthony. Don't lie to me. The desperation in his voice was almost frightening. The will, grandmother's will, did you know about this? Did you plan this? Lower your voice, I said calmly. You're screaming. I'm screaming because my family just lost everything. Because somehow my pregnant wife is now worth more than all of us combined. Because I just spent 14 hours trapped in an airport watching my mother have a nervous breakdown while reporters called asking for statements about the Whitmore inheritance scandal. I found myself oddly detached from his panic. 3 months ago his distress would have sent me running to comfort him. Now I felt like I was watching a stranger fall apart. Where are you? I asked. I'm at the house. Or what used to be our house before you and grandmother decided to steal it from my family. It was never your house, Anthony. It was Stella's house. She can do whatever she wants with her own property. The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Smaller, more confused than angry. How long have you known? Known what? That she was going to do this. That you were going to inherit everything. I thought about lying, about protecting him from the full truth. But we were past the point of gentle deceptions. I found out the night before you left for Martha's Vineyard, I said. When your cousin Margaret suggested I take the bus because I should be grateful you people let me in the house at all. Another silence. Then, that's why you're doing this? Because of something Margaret said. The question revealed everything wrong with Anthony's understanding of our marriage, our family, our entire relationship. He genuinely believed this was about one insult, one moment of thoughtlessness. He couldn't see the pattern of dismissal and contempt that had defined my entire experience with his family. This isn't about Margaret, I said quietly. This is about you laughing when she said it. I hung up before he could respond. Within an hour, cars began arriving at the mansion. I watched from the terrace as Anthony's parents pulled up in their silver Mercedes, followed by Victoria's red BMW, then Margaret's white Range Rover. One by one, the family members who had been so eager to escape on their luxury vacation came crawling back to confront their new reality. But Stella was gone. She'd left before sunrise, taking only a small suitcase and her jewelry box. I'd helped her load her car in the pre-dawn darkness, both of us moving with the quiet efficiency of people executing a well-planned escape. Where will you go? I'd asked. The lake house, she'd replied. It's smaller, quieter. More appropriate for an old woman who just wants to read her books and tend her garden. The lake house that's now technically mine? She'd smiled at that. Technically your child's. I trust you'll let an old woman live there in peace. Now, watching her former family pound on the door of an empty mansion, I understood the strategic brilliance of her departure. She had no interest in facing their anger, their accusations, their desperate attempts at manipulation. She'd made her decision, executed it perfectly, and removed herself from the aftermath. The pounding grew more insistent. Through the windows, I could see Patricia's face pressed against the glass, her perfect makeup smeared from crying. Robert was on his phone, probably calling lawyers, while Victoria and Margaret stood arguing in the driveway. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. Legal challenge filed this morning. Dismissed this afternoon. They hired 3 different law firms. None will touch it. I wasn't surprised. Ashley had spent 40 years building her reputation on cases exactly like this. Wealthy families destroying themselves over money. She'd seen every trick, every loophole, every desperate attempt to overturn an ironclad will. The family's business empire began crumbling within days. Stella had been more than just the family matriarch. She'd been the financial backbone, the co-signer on credit lines, the trusted name that opened doors and secured favorable terms. When news broke that she'd transferred her entire estate to an unborn child, confidence evaporated overnight. I learned about the collapse through news reports rather than family communication. The Whitmore Group's stock price plummeted. Vendors demanded immediate payment on outstanding invoices. Banks called in loans that had been automatically renewed for decades. Whitmore Empire in free fall following inheritance shock, read one headline. From riches to rags, how one will changed everything, declared another. The media coverage was merciless. Business journalists dissected the family's financial structure with surgical precision, revealing how dependent they'd been on Stella's backing. Society reporters whispered about family dysfunction and public humiliation. Social media buzzed with speculation about the mysterious pregnant granddaughter-in-law who'd somehow orchestrated the entire downfall. I wasn't orchestrating anything. I was simply watching it unfold from my small apartment across town, one hand protectively covering my growing belly, trying to process the magnitude of what my child would inherit, and the cost of that inheritance. Anthony appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after their disastrous return. He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled, wearing the same shirt I'd seen him in 2 days earlier on a news broadcast about the family's financial troubles. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the man I'd married. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like grief. His usual easy smile had been replaced by lines of worry and exhaustion. "5 minutes," I said, stepping aside. He sat heavily on my small sofa, the same sofa he'd once joked was charmingly modest compared to the furniture in his family home. Now it probably looked like luxury compared to what he could afford. "I've been thinking," he said, not meeting my eyes. "About what you said. About me laughing." I waited. "I did laugh," he continued. "I laughed because that's what I've always done. When my family makes their little jokes, I laugh along. It's easier than confronting them, easier than making waves. Easier than defending your wife." He looked up then and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Genuine shame. "I failed you," he said simply. "I failed you as a husband and I'm going to fail our child as a father. I've spent my whole life being afraid of my own family, and now I don't even know who I am without their approval." The honesty was startling. For 3 years, I'd waited for Anthony to acknowledge what his silence had cost our marriage. Now that he had, I realized it was too late to matter. "I miss you," he whispered. "I know," I replied. "But missing someone doesn't undo the damage." Anthony left that night without saying goodbye. I watched from my window as he sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, engine running, probably working up the courage to knock on my door again. He never did. The red taillights disappeared around the corner, and somehow I knew it was the last time I'd see him as anything other than a stranger who happened to share my last name. 3 days later Stella called. "I'm tired of this big house," she said without preamble. "All these empty rooms echoing with old arguments. I'm thinking of the lake cottage. Remember it?" I did remember. We'd visited once during my 2nd year of marriage, a small cedar shake house tucked between tall pines on the quiet side of the lake. It had felt like a fairy tale then. All stone fireplaces and built-in bookshelves, with a wraparound porch that faced the water. Anthony had called it rustic with barely concealed disdain, but I'd fallen in love with its simplicity. "You want to move there?" I asked. "I want us to move there." The offer hung in the air like morning mist. Moving in with my estranged husband's grandmother while carrying his child, it should have felt inappropriate, complicated, wrong. Instead it felt like coming home. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "I'm 82 years old, Kristen. I don't waste time on things I'm unsure about." We moved on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves were turning and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. Stella had already arranged for movers to bring only the essentials: her favorite reading chair, boxes of photo albums, the antique rocking chair where she'd nursed her own children decades ago. Everything else stayed behind with the mansion, like artifacts of a life she no longer wanted to claim. The cottage felt different than I remembered. Smaller, cozier, more intimate. Morning sunlight streamed through gauze curtains and the floors creaked pleasantly underfoot. Stella had already stocked the pantry with herbal teas and the kind of crackers that settled an uneasy stomach. "The baby likes it here," she announced after watching me eat breakfast without rushing to the bathroom for the first time in weeks. He was right. The constant nausea that had plagued my first trimester seemed to ease in the peaceful rhythm of lake life. Stella and I developed routines that felt natural rather than forced. Morning tea on the porch, afternoon walks along the shoreline, evenings by the fireplace with books and quiet conversation. It was during one of those evening talks that she brought out the journal. "I've been thinking about what this child should know," she said, settling into her reading chair with a leather-bound notebook. "Not the sanitized family history they teach in private schools, but the real story. The struggles, the mistakes, the lessons learned too late." She opened the journal to reveal pages covered in her precise handwriting. Stories about her husband's humble beginnings as a carpenter's son, about the years they'd scraped and saved to buy their first property, about the business deals that failed before the ones that succeeded. "Your great-great-grandfather was an immigrant," she read aloud. "He came to this country with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could build anything. He would have been horrified to see what his descendants became. People who inherited wealth but never learned to create it." Night after night she added new entries. Stories about the Great Depression, when the family had lost nearly everything and rebuilt from scratch. About her own mother who had started a small bakery to keep food on the table. About the values that had been forgotten as the family grew more comfortable, more insulated, more convinced of their own superiority. "Your turn," she said one evening, sliding the journal across the coffee table. "I don't know what to write. Write about what you want this child to know about you. About love. About choosing kindness over cruelty. My first entry was shaky, uncertain. I wrote about growing up in a small apartment where love was abundant even when money wasn't. About my mother who had worked 2 jobs to put me through college and never once complained. About learning that true strength wasn't about having power over others, but about lifting others up when they needed it most. The entries became a nightly ritual. Sometimes Stella would read passages aloud, her voice carrying the weight of decades. Sometimes I would write while she knitted, the clicking of her needles providing a soothing rhythm. The journal grew thicker, more personal, more precious. Winter settled over the lake like a soft gray blanket. Snow muffled the sounds of the outside world, creating a cocoon of peace around our small cottage. My belly grew rounder, and the baby became more active, as if responding to the calm environment we'd created. The family's silence was deafening in its completeness. No phone calls, no letters, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if we'd simply ceased to exist in their world. Part of me had expected Anthony's mother to reach out, perhaps out of curiosity about her future grandchild. But as weeks turned to months, I realized they'd made their choice. Pride was more important than family. Image was more valuable than love. Stella seemed unsurprised by their absence. "They'll blame you for everything," she said matter-of-factly during one of our morning conversations. "It's easier than admitting they drove away the one person who could have brought them joy." Spring arrived with surprising gentleness. The ice on the lake cracked and melted, revealing dark water that reflected the budding trees. Stella planted a garden behind the cottage. Not the formal arrangements of the mansion, but wild, joyful chaos of vegetables and flowers mixed together. "Every child should know where food comes from," she explained, her hands already dirty from the soil. "Should understand that good things require patience and care." The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday in April, delivered by a courier who seemed apologetic about disturbing our peaceful morning. I signed them at the kitchen table while Stella made pancakes, the domestic normalcy making the legal dissolution feel almost anticlimactic. Anthony hadn't contested anything. No fight over assets we'd never really shared. No battle over custody arrangements for a child he'd never expressed interest in meeting. Just clean, simple documentation that reduced 3 years of marriage to a few paragraphs of legal language. "How do you feel?" Stella asked after the courier left. I considered the question seriously. "Free," I said finally. "Sad but free." She nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. "Sadness passes. Freedom endures." The day Elise was born was the first warm day of summer. I'd been having contractions since dawn, and Stella had timed them with the precision of someone who'd done this before. We drove to the hospital in comfortable silence, the windows down and the scent of honeysuckle filling the car. Elise arrived just after sunset, small and perfect and furiously angry about being displaced from her warm, dark world. When the doctor placed her in my arms, I felt a shift in the universe. Not dramatic but profound. Everything that had come before led to this moment. Every hurt, every betrayal, every difficult choice had been worthwhile because they'd brought me here to her. Stella cried when she held her great-granddaughter for the first time. Real tears, the kind that come from joy too big for words. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Later that night, as I nursed Elise by the window overlooking the lake, Stella added a new entry to the journal. "Today the real inheritance began," she read aloud as she wrote. "Not money or property but love passed down through generations. This child will know she is cherished not for what she owns, but for who she is." Outside, fireflies began their nightly dance over the water, and I realized that this quiet cottage, this peaceful lake, this fierce, loving woman who had chosen to rebuild her legacy around kindness, this was what wealth really looked like. If this story of justice and family betrayal had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Stella calmly rewrote her will while the family laughed at Kristen, having no idea their world was about to change forever. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.